Good afternoon, everyone. And it's week 11. And so let's get underway and look at several examples today of language, of inspiration, motivation. Before we get to that, let's talk a bit about the term paper. And remember, this counts 20% of your grade. Just to go through again with you, to select an example of what is generally regarded as verbal art in English. Now, this could be a poem, could be not the whole movie script, obviously, an extract from it, an extract from a novel, can be a speech, can be a song. Now, your essay, once you've selected something hopefully that you yourself are fond of and consider to be art and consider to be perhaps inspirational, motivational to yourself. Now, your essay should discuss the following. How is it an example of an extended metaphor involving symbolic articulation? I'll say a bit more about that later, just to sort of, even though we've covered this ground, I'll just talk a bit about that again at the beginning of today's lecture. What is an extended metaphor? What is symbolic articulation, as we've been discussing it? How does language and metaphor contribute to the readers, the listeners' positive evaluation of your selected example? I mean, what role has language played, has metaphor played in achieving this evaluation as art, as being something that is positively evaluated, as something that is truly valued? Now, I indicate here this: you will need to cite sources to support the claim that readers, listeners value your selected example. Your selected example. Verbal art, invention, or inspiration. You might say, well, invention, isn't that science? But we looked at, for example, Darwin's, and we've looked at Halliday's analysis of that text that demonstrated that there's more going on there than just what one might say the language of science. It is the language of science, but it's done in what is almost an art. It's to say that it's very nearly literature doesn't do justice to it. Okay, it's a scientific treatise that is equally literature in the usual sense that we think of it. Now, pay attention to this aspect of it. To me, this is quite an important thing. So when I take a look at a text, as we have, and I usually want to see that not just myself, it's not just my own subjective opinion that, oh, this is really art. This is highly valued. Not just my own opinion. I want to verify, or we could say validate my evaluation by finding others that agree with that evaluation, that are also evaluating it as art, valuing it as an example of what we're calling verbal art. Well, let me give you some examples from what we've been looking at. For example, when we looked at David Foster Wallace's commencement speech, well, what makes that speech special? Well, you notice that Time magazine indicates that is really at the sort of top 10 of what they regard to be one of the best commencement speeches. All right. So in this sense, then, when we consider what we're looking at. Where is there sort of validation coming in from other sources that say, yes, this is others' opinion as well. Now, this could be, when I looked at the commencement speech, Time Magazine's top 10, or when I've looked at, for example, when we looked at the debate performance of Obama, there was polling that indicated how people responded. There were people writing about it in the newspaper. And nowadays, there are indeed examples that one can find of academic publications discussing that text. So there's plenty of material there that is discussing it. So that's what I want you to do. I want you to find something that you can find other material, other sources. Now, again, one more example: Brandon Leak's AGT, America's Got Talent performance, his spoken word performance. You remember how when I presented it to you, I began by showing you this is how the judges responded. First of all, hey, this is going to be poetry. They were very, at least Simon Cowell, one of the judges, was very skeptical. It did challenge the usual kind of performance on one of these talent shows. Poetry. But do you notice what the response was afterwards? And then he goes on to win America's Got Talent. Well, that's obviously he won the public support for people responded to it. How do people respond? So it could be something like one of the examples I've illustrated. It could be looking up and finding an academic journal paper on perhaps the poem that you've chosen, or something that's discussed in some kind of discussion that validates the fact that this isn't just your opinion. This isn't just, I like this poetry. So unless, for example, you might say, well, can I use my own poetry? Well, not unless you've got somehow a validation for the fact that your poetry is evaluated indeed as verbal art. All right, so I hope you are getting the idea. And that will also determine the text that you're going to choose, the example you're going to choose. The fact that this is a requirement, this is important. Now, that means that you will have sources. You will have to have references. You will have to be citing sources. It just won't be, in other words, I would definitely expect there has to be a references section at the end of your term paper, because you will have to be citing some other sources to back up your claim. So that should be in your references. Minimum word count, 800 words. Make sure that you meet the minimum requirement. All right, it's a silly waste of points at the end. When I come to assessing the paper, if I have to deduct points for the fact that you didn't come up to the minimum word count, that's pay attention to that. That is a requirement. I will deduct points if it is less than that minimum word count of 800 words. Okay, so I hope that this is clear. It is due on the 23rd of April. That's the end of the review week. So there's still time. And again, if you have any question about what you are going to choose, if you want to run it by me, feel free to email me about it. All right, and when you do, if you have indicated something, tell me if you've been able to find sources that support the claim that indeed it is valued. It can be verbal art, it can be invention, it can be inspiration, a motivational speech, a commencement speech. And we're going to be looking at more of those today as well. Last continuous participation task. And for many of you, you've kept up with this. Great. You got your 20%. All right. So this is the last one. It is already published, and you can find it, and it is due on the 9th of April. 9th of April. So do finish that last continuous participation task. Identify linguistic features of motivation speeches. Well, we'll also be, as I've said, talking about motivation speeches today. So that should very much help when you come to preparing your last and final continuous participation task. All right. Halliday says, in real life, texts carry value. We evaluate. We assess. We assess how appropriate it is, how suitable it is, how polite it is. But here we're talking about something else, and this is a kind of value that we're calling something as art. Puts it in a class that it's considered to be something which really has an aesthetic value. Halliday goes on, we need to explain that value in terms of what we know about semiosis, about meaning and how meaning is made. What really I'm asking you to do in that term paper is to say to me, this text carries value. Here's the proof. This is how people have responded to it. Either people writing an academic paper or some poll or some other way that validates that claim. And second, I'm going to explain why it's valued that way in terms of how we make meaning through language. How does language work? How is it an example of metaphor? Now, what we've brought to this study of the language of art, invention, and inspiration, what we've brought to it is an approach. The approach of this linguist, Michael Halliday. Michael Halliday pioneered this approach called systemic functional linguistics. And what he's saying is that we need to have a theory and a method, and this is what he's proposing, a way to do the analysis of the language, a linguistic analysis. He calls it grammatics. As he's saying, it's the way we use the wording, the words and the wording, the combination of words, that's the grammar. And that combination of words, that grammar realizes meaning. And we need a way to be able to analyze a text, be able to look at a text, discuss it in terms of how it's making meaning. And this approach we should be able to apply to any text. That is what he's saying. The alternative. What's the alternative? The alternative is, as he puts it, and he's being rather dismissive when he says ad hoc, do-it-yourself kit of private commentary. That's exactly what your term paper should not be. An ad hoc, anyhow, do-it-yourself. How do I understand this? How do I look at it? How do I appreciate it? Private commentary, just your own view. We're looking for something beyond that. We're looking at an approach, and that's what we've been talking about and looking at. If we don't have that approach, if we're just relying on this ad hoc, do-it-yourself kit of private commentary, then we don't have a way to explain how texts are similar, why one is art, why one is not. Their differences in aesthetically, why do we appreciate one over another? Functional values, how does it fulfill the function it's supposed to? That was the example of that court case. We were looking at why didn't the judge's summation of evidence really meet the need that was required for that use of language in the courtroom. What didn't fit? Well, to explain that, we need to go back and look at the language. To explain their similarities and differences, the aesthetic and functional values that differentiate one text from another or one voice from another within the frontiers of the same text. We began with this sort of foundational statement, and that is that language, from day one, from lecture one, we've been saying that language is more than just a system of meaning. It is a system that makes meaning. It's choices. It's choices of what you're going to say or what you're not going to say that is going to mean something to your receiver of your communication. And when we talk about meaning, we're talking about meaning in perhaps a quite a different sense than usually. Usually for most of us, when we talk about meaning, it's just the ideas, right? It's just the way we reflect on the world and talk about what's going on in the world. We've used the expression, the way we construe the world. Because how we see the world is, how do you know that the way I see the world is how you see the world? How do we know how we perceive it? Well, the only way that we really are able to sort of share those perceptions, that idea, is through language. Language is the vehicle by which we're able to share, to become aware of how so-and-so is construing the world, and maybe how I'm construing the world. How is it the same? How is it different? But meaning is more than that. Meaning is also how I'm relating to that person. When we talk about politeness, we're talking about the way you should behave in language. That's one aspect of interpersonal. Who can you sort of point the finger and say, you should do this? Well, that is going to depend on the interpersonal relations that exist and what is appropriate, and how what we do in language communicates the fact of how I do see my role, how I see our status, if we're at the same level, or is there a difference? This is going to come through with language. And finally, how that all comes into a text, how that all comes to be realized. Meaning, as it really takes shape, that textual meaning. So what is meaning? We've been talking about that, and we've been saying that then meaning is something which is enabled by the grammar. Halliday uses that word lexicogrammar. What he's meaning is lexico is words. What Halliday is saying is it is words, but it's also the wording. And so he says, thinking about, if you're going to think about meaning, you have to think grammatically. You have to think about the wording. And when we talk about the wording, there were several kinds of questions that we've been asking. Asking questions like, what kind of processes are taking place? And this is, when you talk about what's going on in the world, are you using a mental process? Are you using an action doing process? Are you using a verbal process? How do you see that event? Who is initiating it? Who is affected by it? We've illustrated this before, why this is important. We illustrated it with the Donald Jung speech, with the Susan Rice speech. So there is an importance to the kinds of processes you use and who is the initiator of those processes. It tells you something about the text. It has to do with choices that are being made about how you construe the world. There are others that we've been talking about. When it comes to the logical, are there dependent clauses? How are the clauses combined? Parataxis, hypotaxis, two terms that by now you should be quite familiar with. Going on, when Russell Mears, in his book, and I don't know if any of you have gotten that book. It's, again, I encourage you. It would be a very interesting read. Poet's Voice in the Making of Mind. And I'll just go to that last point that is here on the screen, the one I've highlighted. It's not just about the words, but it's also about the wordings. It's how the words are used in a symbolic way. And that's so important to what you are going to be saying in your commentary, your discussion. How are the words used in a symbolic way? And when we say symbolic, we're talking about metaphor. How are the words combined in such a way as Mears describes, evoke, he says, a sense of reality that none of them possess alone. And you remember Halliday did a study of Alfred Lord Tennyson's In Memoriam. It's a poem. A poem, clearly verbal art. There's some very interesting things we didn't discuss it. And so all I'm really wanting to get at is a point that is made here at the bottom, where Halliday begins his discussion of Tennyson's poem by pointing to another paper that was written earlier. This author, Walker Gibson, he quotes him as saying, "I submit then that Tennyson's poetic imagination can sometimes be examined in terms of his grammar." That is what you need to do as well. You are examining what you are going to say. You're saying this is an example of verbal art, but you need to look at it in terms of the use of language. And when we say the use of language, we mean in terms of, yes, the grammar. And when we've talked about grammar, though, this is the kind of thing we're talking about. Now, where does it then become symbolic? How do you take combine words in such a way as to create a meaning that the words themselves do not have alone? And for this, I turn to Professor Ruqayyah Hasan and her discussion, Linguistics, Language, and Verbal Art. And what she's saying about how there's this second order of meaning. The whole point of verbal art is that it's not just, you can't just take it on the surface. There's another level of meaning. There's another significance. And she's saying that this is achieved by symbolic articulation. Again, by packing it into the nominalization here, sometimes sort of hides the meaning. I like to unpack that into its verbs. What we're talking about is articulating symbols, articulating, expressing, communicating symbols, symbolic meaning, metaphoric meaning. So how do we articulate the symbolic meaning? To go back to a point that we've been making from, again, several times and talked about quite a lot, and some of you I know have this sort of, you understand this. But let me just go through it. I know in some respects these notions are probably, before you took this course, you never thought about it this way. And I hope that by taking this course, you've come to see it a different way than what you perhaps have looked at poetry before. That's what I shared with you, my experience. From most of my life, I was not interested in poetry at all. It had no impact on me at all. Until I came across, I approached text as a linguist, yes, but the linguistics and literature, they seemed quite far apart. My interest did not extend to literature. Yeah, I enjoyed reading novels and what would be considered the classics and so forth, but not really appreciating the way language was used or why they were considered classics. So how does that happen? Hassan's point is that what the artist does is mobilize, put into use the habitual patterns, the ways we typically use language, habitual patterns of grammatical choice. That we've seen it in examples throughout the semester, and turning those choices into a non-habitual consistency, a pattern that stands out, a frequency that cannot be denied, a statistical prominence. Statistically, yeah, you can quantify it and validate that indeed there is a pattern there of something that's repeated. That's the basis for being able to foreground. You cannot foreground except there's a background. And the background is taking the ways that we use language, the typical ways, the ordinary ways that we use language, and turning them into a non-habitual consistency. Foregrounding. And the whole point of why we do the foregrounding, and foregrounding basically is taking that pattern that's been mobilized through these habitual patterns in a non-habitual consistency, and against that background, repatterning, taking a different pattern that breaks that background, that automatic theme. That is the outcome, the purpose. The purpose is that deeper meaning. The purpose is to get across a point to the reader. And what is that point? It is the artist's hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. Something about life is being said. It is the artist's own hypothesis, the artist's own perception that the artist is trying to put across. That is that deeper meaning. And what Hassan says is that the theme, this idea that the artist is putting forward, this hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man, may not be something that we immediately understand or notice. Sometimes it will pass us by, but sometimes the whole goal, though, is that it should be what stays there in your consciousness. It's a deeper meaning which perhaps might reside deeper within your consciousness. Your consciousness. Long after you've forgotten the patterns, long after those the wordings are no longer remembered, what sticks with you, what stays with you, is that deeper meaning, that hypothesis. And that's basically what she's saying. That is the art. That is what defines art. It isn't even the fact that it just has aesthetically something that is attractive. It should have a message. It should have a theme, a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. So she puts it like this: the patterns of language, the patterning, that the choices that are being made taking the way that we normally use language, and the choices, the pattern, point us in a particular direction. They're taking us down one path, and it is accomplished message by message, clause by clause. You can examine each clause and look at it in terms of the pattern that is being established, the pattern that is being built up. But in the end, it's going to be the totality of these messages that is what's going to give us a theme. This is what we're getting at, is the notion of the extended metaphor. It is a metaphor that is across the text. It is something which is built up clause by clause, message by message, but then in the end, it's the totality of these messages that have produced a pattern, that have produced an automatic against which the artist foregrounds, against which the artist repatterns. What's the word that we used for this? Against which the artist de-automatizes. De-automatization. Very important concept, because it's at the heart of our ability to create these symbols, to create these metaphors. It is through a kind of de-automatization. It's going against what we are sort of habitually used to. Now, Halliday prefers this term. Why? Because it explains a lot more than just foregrounding. Foregrounding is a kind of de-automatization. De-automatization is the broader term. What is the meaning of de-automatization? It's to say that you have level of semantics, meaning, and then you have the lower level systems, grammar, and there's a connection, and there's almost the fact that the grammar is tied to the meaning. But then when you break that relation, another way to put it more positively is when you free the grammar from the control of the semantics, so that grammar can be used in a completely different way. When you do that, what you're doing is de-automatization. You are expanding the meaning space of what is available and how meaning can be conveyed. So I want you to realize the fact that when we say verbal science, the way we write for science, that is inventiveness. So the same way in which we use language to be inventive, it's the same sort of meaning-making ability that is at the heart of both the way we make science, the way we communicate science, the way we make art. To explain it, again, go back to the point. Halliday is saying that you have the grammar, nouns. They are things. Adjectives are qualities. We've talked about this, as we said, the relation of congruence. We're saying it is the way, when you use a noun, it means a thing. When you use a verb, it's related to a process. But the point is that is the automatic, that is the default, that is the congruent. But then we can decouple the process from the verb. In fact, turning it into a noun. And then that process takes on the qualities of nounness. Again, that's like a metaphor, yes. And Halliday calls it what? A grammatical metaphor. It is this being able to decouple, to de-automatize. This ability to be able to, the common way we say is think outside the box, right? To think in a completely different way, to choose to be able to do something unlike it's been done before, unlike how it's been said before. This is creativity. This is inventiveness. And this creativity, this inventiveness, this is at the heart of what inspires us. So grammatical metaphor, the ability to innovate in language, not just in words, but in terms of the grammar, grammatical structures. And what that means is that when we talk about the language of science, we've said that there's a shift that's going on. And that shift, verbs and adjectives becoming nouns, conjunctions becoming verbs, and so on and so forth. We've talked about this, that there's a number of things that are happening grammatically. And the fact is that this is happening with such a regularity, with such an intensity, that the shifts become the drift. It becomes the direction into which the language is being taken. And what is being created is a new automatic. We start with the congruent, the direct. Verbs are processes. Things are nouns. We take that, we make these decouplings and recouplings, and so processes can be expressed as nouns, turning them into things. Well, that becomes so often the case that it is the way language is now drifted. It is creating a new way of speaking. It is creating a new kind of language. It is creating a new automatic. The language of science is a new way of speaking. It is a new variety of language. And where did it come from? In the English language. It came through people like Sir Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin. Yes, they shaped the language by the way they wrote. Language is evolving. Language is changing. What you have today, what we see today in terms of the language of science, that isn't to say that it will always remain that way. It is something that's gone through a great deal of nominalization. Some are suggesting that maybe it's going to go in a different direction. For Halliday, there is a particular significance in probabilistic choices, probabilistic shifts in the lexicogrammatical system, the language of science, verbal science. For Hassan, it is deautomatization again, but a different kind of metaphor-making power that is there. It is, as we've said, mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice, taking the way you use language, creating a pattern in that text, in that example of poetry, in that example of a script for a movie. Creating a pattern, and out of that pattern being able to, creating an automatic against which to deautomatize, creating a pattern in order to break the pattern. We ask that question, how do you know then when it's really just by, when is it art? When is it by accident? How do you know it's really deliberately the artist is creating this pattern that the artist then will foreground against? How do you know the statistical prominence isn't just happen chance? When is it deliberate? And there, Hassan said, you have to look at it from two standpoints. You'll notice contrasts. Yes, the foregrounding is a contrast. The consistency, where does it sort of occur on various levels? And the contrasts we looked at, one of the examples was Hassan's own analysis of Les Murray's Widower in the Country. And you'll remember there were several levels on which contrasts occur. I won't repeat this. We've talked about this before. But the idea being that there is a consistency, that there is, in a way, throughout the poem, a coming together, an accumulation of foregrounding logical meaning, process, theme. There's a consistency, and that consistency, what does it do? You can locate it. You can see where it occurs in the text, and where it occurs in the text is where the artist is drawing your attention to the artist's hypothesis. And that existential fabric of the text itself, the patterning, the automatic that takes over in that text, and then how it is foregrounded, de-automatized. I'm using the same words that Halliday used when he talked about the language of science. We're using the same words because it's the same phenomena. It's the same ability. It is this metaphor-making ability, whether it's making grammatical metaphors, lexical metaphors, or extended metaphors. What is the result is a theme, a hypothesis. Hassan said that what she felt was that it was the idea that we need people, we need community, we need others. And that was the hypothesis that was being able to be put across through the patterns that were created and foregrounding against those patterns that brought us to this meaning, this theme. This is what we mean by an extended metaphor. I'm going to take a break here because we're going to be going on to talk about the commencement speech by Steve Jobs. And before we get into that, I think probably here would be a good point, and a little bit earlier than normal, but let's take the break now. And it's according to my time here, it's 12:42. So if we could begin again around 12:52. All right, so let's just take a break for about 10 minutes, okay? And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. All right, let's take a break then. Okay, let's continue. And I just, before we go on to this Steve Jobs commencement speech and talk about it in more detail, I did want to highlight this point, and that's why I've just run through the previous sort of review of what we've been discussing throughout the semester, because the first part of this term paper is you discussing how what you have chosen is an example of an extended metaphor involving symbolic articulation. So those two terms there, extended metaphor, symbolic articulation, I think we've discussed them before, and I hope that it's clear what I'll be looking for in terms of how you'll be approaching what it is that you have chosen. All right. So that said, let's move on to talking about Steve Jobs. His commencement speech at Stanford University, delivered in the same year as David Foster Wallace's Kenyon College. One of the top 10 commencement speeches. So this commencement address, as I say, it was Stanford University, and it's again quite a famous address. We know, and we've already established what is a commencement speech or commencement address, as they put it. It's simply means that at a graduation ceremony, in this U.S. especially, most universities, especially the top-ranked universities, are able to attract very high-name celebrities, celebrities that may be celebrated not just in the sense of show business, actors, although quite a few are well-known commencement speech presenters, but also those from business, those from science, politics, all right, would be invited to give a commencement address. Now, this commencement address, when you listen to it, I'm interested in how you respond to it. But what I do want you to realize, even before you start listening to it, is that there is a design to it. There is a craft to it. There is the rule of three, and we've seen this before in so many speeches that are given. We've seen it in Obama's speeches. It's very characteristic of speeches that are intended to motivate people. We repeat things in threes. So about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space, about what makes great typography great, about. Beautiful, historical, artistically subtle. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment, all 3 times. It means to try to tell your kids everything you thought you'd have the next 10 years to tell them in just a few months. It means to make sure everything is buttoned up so that it will be as easy as possible for your family. It means, when he concludes, don't waste, don't be trapped, don't let, it's the imperative, don't. And in fact, this phrase that he is famous for, stay hungry, stay foolish, he repeats 3 times throughout the commencement speech. So the rule of 3, things repeated 3 times. Oh, that's one aspect of the craft, of the design. The other is use of contrasting words, juxtaposing contrasting words. We've seen in poetry. You remember Edwin Tombu's Gods Can Die, right? Well, something happening here similar, and you sense he talks about dropped out, dropped in. He repeats that, dropped out, dropped in, looking forward, looking backwards, the heaviness, the lightness, death, life, old, new, the contrast. I think I've told you before, I like to do a word cloud of any text that I'm looking at, because it just to give me a feel. And here's the word cloud. You know what a word cloud is, of course. It's the words that occur more frequently, more prominently, are larger. The font is larger so that they stand out visually to us. And we see life very much standing out. College, Apple, and a few others that stand out, but life and college, those 2 stand out the most. Apple, we'll see a reason why these 3 stand out. Well, quickly to come to the point, it's because this speech is composed of 3 stories. 3 stories, as he'll say, of his life. He's presenting, as is often the case with these commencement speeches. What's happening is that the speaker is invited because the speaker is considered a success in whatever profession or occupation he or she has chosen. So they are to sort of be able to, their role here is to sort of explain to these graduates who are starting out in looking for their place in an occupation or profession, how they can be successful, like the speaker. The speaker is giving advice. The speaker is trying to motivate. So the speaker tells a narrative. The narrative is the speaker's own story. But here, Steve Jobs broke it down into three stories that make up his commencement speech as a whole. The first one you can see is what? College. Second one, well, there's no doubt about it. Apple. Remember, Apple does not figure quite that prominently as much as life in what we just looked at. Apple isn't that, it's almost the same as looking, and one stand out perhaps even more, but it really stands out in that second story, because that had to do with when Steve Jobs got fired from Apple. And the last, death. The last story is when he was told the first time about cancer and how he responded and what happened. All right, so the three stories. Well, let's take a look at these three stories.
Today, I want to tell you three stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just three stories. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why'd I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever, because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart even when it leads you off the well-worn path, and that will make all the difference.
All right, now that's the first story. How do you respond? How did you, as you listened to it? As I listened to it, I found it was quite easy to follow. I found, a typical sort of Steve Jobs. He makes it interesting. It is obviously he's reading it, but at the same time, in a way, it almost has a certain conversational style to it. And so it doesn't come across as difficult to follow. It has been written in such a way for it to come out in a very almost spoken style. We've seen different examples. In that courtroom example, you remember the judge read the summation of evidence. Now, that became difficult to follow because obviously something is different here. Something is different in terms of how this has been written as opposed to how that summation of evidence had been written. Something I want you to notice at the end. Now, while this is largely it's first person, and that's to be expected because it's his story, notice how it ends. You can't connect the dots looking forward. You. The shift to the second person. You. Now, I want you to look at that and pay attention to that in the next story that we're going to be looking at. But first this, I'm going to look at the kinds of processes that are being used. Remember what we said, one of the questions that we can ask about it grammatically is, what kind of processes? Is it the verb to be, the verb to have, relational? Is it doing kind of processes? We call those material. Mental, thinking, feeling. Verbal, saying something. Well, so far, what have we looked at? Well, 56% of it is doing. So it's a rather active kind of speech that he's giving. It's what is being done. Less so in terms of relational. It's about a quarter of it is describing something. 13 mental, not that much. Verbal, again, not that much. Okay, let's continue. Let's go on to story 2.
My second story is about love and loss. I was lucky. I found what I loved to do early in life. Woz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us in a garage into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. We just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I just turned 30. And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started? Well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented to run the company with me. And for the first year or so, things went well. But then our visions of the future began to diverge, and eventually we had a falling out. When we did, our board of directors sided with him. And so at 30, I was out, and very publicly out. What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. I really didn't know what to do for a few months. I felt that I had let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down, that I had dropped the baton as it was being passed to me. I met with David Packard and Bob Noyce and tried to apologize for screwing up so badly. I was a very public failure, and I even thought about running away from the valley. But something slowly began to dawn on me. I still loved what I did. The turn of events at Apple had not changed that one bit. I'd been rejected, but I was still in love. And so I decided to start over. I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. During the next 5 years, I started a company named Next, another company named Pixar, and fell in love with an amazing woman who would become my wife. Pixar went on to create the world's first computer animated feature film, Toy Story, and is now the most successful animation studio in the world. In a remarkable turn of events, Apple bought Next, and I returned to Apple, and the technology we developed at Next is at the heart of Apple's current renaissance. And Lorene and I have a wonderful family together. I'm pretty sure none of this would have happened if I hadn't been fired from Apple. It was awful tasting medicine, but I guess the patient needed it. Sometimes life's going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love. And that is as true for work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life. And the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking and don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it. And like any great relationship, it just gets better and better as the years roll on. So keep looking. Don't settle.
All right, so second story. Again, I think you noticed at the end that shift to the second person, you, repeated so many times. By now, I think you should be also paying attention. How come it comes across almost conversational-like? You'll notice a lot of short sentences that sort of break up the text. Not real long, not lots of clauses combined together. More simple sentences, simple clauses. Here again, I've continued on with story 2, and again looking at the process types, and no great difference in terms of story 2 and story 1. Let's go on to story 3.
My third story is about death. When I was 17, I read a quote that went something like, "If you live each day as if it was your last, someday you'll most certainly be right." It made an impression on me, and since then, for the past 33 years, I've looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I am about to do today? And whenever the answer has been no for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. About a year ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. I had a scan at 7:30 in the morning, and it clearly showed a tumor on my pancreas. I didn't even know what a pancreas was. The doctors told me this was almost certainly a type of cancer that is incurable, and that I should expect to live no longer than 3 to 6 months. My doctor advised me to go home and get my affairs in order, which is doctor's code for prepare to die. It means to try and tell your kids everything you thought you'd have the next 10 years to tell them in just a few months. It means to make sure everything is buttoned up so that it will be as easy as possible for your family. It means to say your goodbyes. I lived with that diagnosis all day. Later that evening, I had a biopsy where they stuck an endoscope down my throat, through my stomach and into my intestines, put a needle into my pancreas and got a few cells from the tumor. I was sedated, but my wife, who was there, told me that when they viewed the cells under a microscope, the doctors started crying because it turned out to be a very rare form of pancreatic cancer that is curable with surgery. I had the surgery, and thankfully, I'm fine now. This was the closest I've been to facing death, and I hope it's the closest I get for a few more decades. Having lived through it, I can now say this to you with a bit more certainty than when death was a useful but purely intellectual concept. No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it. And that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Right now, the new is you. But someday, not too long from now, you will gradually become the old and be cleared away. Sorry to be so dramatic, but it's quite true. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. When I was young...
Okay, now there is a final sort of, unrelated to the three stories, there is a final conclusion. I'm not going to play that now. I'm going to focus on the three stories. And again, I've done the same thing I did before. I looked at the sort of relational process, verb to be, the verb to have. It's much more prominent in the third story. Doing is much less in the third story. Mental processes, verbal processes, nothing significant to notice here. One thing that obviously stands out is the repetition of I. I as the grammatical subject, as the doer, as the one who feels, as the one who is. In all three stories. But of course, that is to be expected. As we said, though, as he gets to the conclusion of each of those stories, it comes round to you. Let's just take a look then at those doing processes and who is the doer? Who is the initiator of that doing? Well, we notice that in the first story, story 1, 33% of the doing is done by himself. This drops in story 2 to 20%, and finally in story 3, 14%. What does that sort of coincide with? It coincides with the first story. He more or less was in control. He could make a decision. He decided to drop out and decided what he was going to do with his life. Story 2, he's fired from Apple. He's less in control. Story 3, he's given this diagnosis of cancer, the possibility of death. He is not in control. Yes, the patterning here coincides with what each of these stories is telling us. And as far as what we can see is the I, the first person, it is less and less the one who initiates the actions that are being carried out. What else am I going to look at? What about what we call logical meaning? For example, simple clauses. Okay, simple versus complex. Simple, you know what I mean? We've already said what is a clause. A clause has a verb, a main verb. That's it. Whenever you see a main verb, that is a clause. And so what we're saying is you have a sentence which is made up of one main verb, one clause. That's a simple clause. No other attachments, no other conjunctions. All right, so simple. 21%, 24%, third story, 17%. Nothing, again, really very remarkable. I mean, when we do this kind of sort of forensic study, some things will stand out, some things won't. But the next one does. When I do look at those clauses that are combined together, and I'm taking a look at where is their parataxis and hypotaxis and what is the percentage of both, there's a difference. And it's quite a sharp difference. The first story and the third story are almost the same, right? 38 to 62, 32 to 68. That's almost the same, except the second story is almost half-half. Now, that percentage, that proportion, if we go down, take a look at the projection, that is where it's a process of saying or a process of sensing, thinking, feeling. And we're taking that projected clause, the that clause, treating it separately. And what we notice is that when we do that, again, we still have a higher percentage of hypotaxis in the first story and the third story. But when we take out the projection, the projected clauses, the that clauses, well, we notice the second story is highly paratactic, meaning that a lot of it is, it's not sort of a development of an idea. It's adding, extending the story, and it's, in a way, perhaps gives it a more of a, what can I say? It's less like it's something being thought out. That's what you see when you see something which is highly hypotactic. Paratactic, it's more him telling it. In a way, it's quite a different, what we might consider the texture is quite different of the second story. Now, if I compare it with what we've looked at before in those speeches of Nixon, Obama, and even Trump, you'll notice that in those speeches, what can we see? Where a speech is spontaneous, or in other ways, extemporaneous, and it's being spoken on the spot, it's not written down. We noticed in the departure speech for Nixon, 63 to 37, highly paratactic. When we looked at Trump's speaking, when it was the speech to CIA, it was almost half-half. Obama's inaugural, remember, 48 to 52, almost half-half, and highly criticized for being so diffuse and so sort of not like it was one developing idea. Interestingly, that the second story stands out in this way. What does it perhaps express but something of the response, Steve Jobs himself, to that second story? When I look at the speech as it develops, and in a way I do see that and do sort of a mapping of the paragraphs and how the paragraphs relate one to the other. Now, I'm just showing you this to give you some sort of feel for the fact that the first 8 paragraphs are really sort of developing. Now, let's see how that sort of maps out, why I map it the way I did. So it begins the first story, and that is sort of the announcement, the first story. So I'm taking that sort of as the core element. And then what follows is the elaboration of what this first story, what it is, connecting the dots, how that all is sort of elaborating what we start off with. All right, so paragraphs 3 through 9, that is the first story. Now, paragraph 9 is that switch to you. It is the conclusion. It's here where he is telling the audience how he expects them to take what he's saying, take the advice, and what actions they should take. You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust. It has made, and the approach has never let me down, and it has made all the difference in my life. All right, so you have that switch to the second person. Paragraph 3, how does it end? Well, it ends with a question. So why did I drop out? So it poses a question. Now, where is that question going to be answered? Well, paragraphs 4 through 8. In paragraphs 4 through 8, how is it related again? Well, you notice something we've called sort of a logical progression, thematic progression. Where paragraph 4 ends, someday go to college. And then what's picked up in paragraph 5? How does it begin? 17 years later, I did go to college. So paragraphs 5 through 8 sort of elaborate this idea of going to college. So again, that sort of block 5 through 8. Paragraph 5 is interesting because in that paragraph is mentioned the best. He says the best decisions. If you go through the 3 stories, you'll find that each story mentions something as being the best. Now, it seems that sort of where he talks about something being the best is sort of the core of that story. And in this case, we take paragraph 5 to be sort of the core of the story, what it was to be going to college, which then is elaborated in paragraph 6 through 8. And what do we see about? It wasn't all romantic, paragraph 6. How does that end then? Let me give you one example. So what are 7 and 8? They're an example of how he sort of stumbled onto something that in a way was able to turn a negative, dropping out, into something positive. He goes on to elaborate that in 7 and 8. He talks about Reed College, and then that as a background to what follows in 8. So it is a progression. There's a progression of the ideas. In a way that the structure is rather hypotactic. There is sort of a logical progression to how the text proceeds in a very coherent way, and he's signaling that all along as we go through it, like by asking a question, by let me give you an example. So he's alerting us. We see the signals that are there that show us what that logical progression of the story is as it unfolds. That's part of what we begin to see in this text. It is also the fact that as we notice, a lot more simple clauses, simple sentences. So the text has a structure. The text has an architecture we can talk about. Now I took the you, and where does the second person pronoun you or your occur in the text? You'll notice that again it's the second story stands out. You most prominently. We see you sort of spread throughout the third story, and we see it much less spread out in the first story, and then sort of finally in paragraph 9. But in paragraph 15, that's where he mentions you the most frequently. It's interesting that the second story, him getting fired from Apples, has such a different sort of texture than the rest of the text, than either the first story or the third story. All right, so we've taken a look at Steve Jobs, and now let's take a look at another commencement speaker, very well known, Denzel Washington. Let's take a look at this video. Sort of takes several of his commencement speeches and in a way sort of puts them together. Let's notice what is being said, and afterwards we're going to again come back to this point. What do you see as sort of typical features of commencement speeches?
I found that nothing in life is worthwhile unless you take risks. Nothing. Nelson Mandela said, "There is no passion to be found playing small." Concept. Reggie Jackson struck out 2,600 times in his career, the most in the history of baseball. But you don't hear about the strikeouts. People remember the home runs. Fall forward. Thomas Edison conducted 1,000 failed experiments. Did you know? Ghosts are going to be around your bed. What are you going to do with what you have? I'm not talking about how much you have. Some of you are business majors, some of you are theologians, nurses, sociologists, some of you have money, some of you have patience, some of you have kindness, some of you have love, some of you have the gift of long suffering, whatever it is, whatever your gift is. Who was
go through it. What expansions? So far, these are on our list and mental processes. All right, again, we have don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. But remember, those are all how you things 3 times and all paratactically join. I prayed, and I prayed to fail, 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 repeating things in threes. Power processes, quite frequent. Remember something about David Foster Wallace. Time magazine, and let me read this again. I read it previously to you, but let me
Thanks and lost in abstract arguments inside my head instead of simply paying attention to what's going on right in front of me. Paying attention to what is going on inside me.
Okay.
Think of the old cliche about, quote, the mind being an excellent servant but a terrible master. This, like many cliches, so lame and unexciting on the surface, actually expresses a great and terrible truth. It is not the least bit coincidental that adults who commit suicide with firearms almost always shoot themselves in the head. They shoot the terrible master. And the truth is that most of these suicides are actually dead long before they pull the trigger. And I submit that this is what the real, no bullshit value of your liberal arts education is supposed to be about. How to keep from going through your comfortable, prosperous, respectable adult life dead, unconscious, a slave to your head and to your natural default setting of being uniquely, completely, imperially alone, day in and day out.
It's the anti-text. You remember what we meant by that was that it goes against the grain of what we expect. It goes against the genre of what we expect a commencement speech to be like. It goes against the grain. It goes against the pattern of what the style of what David Foster Wallace is like. It was a sharp contrast. It was the anti-text. In every way, it more or less is running counter to our expectations. What is an anti-language? What is an anti-text? I'm looking back at what Halliday said about anti-language, and he says it arises when the alternative reality is a counter-reality set up in opposition to some established norm. And that is David Foster Wallace's point. The point that he's making is to establish a counter-reality to our default setting, our automatic. Halliday says it is thus not the distance between the two realities, but the tension between them that is significant. The distance need not be very great. The one is, in fact, a metaphorical variant of the other. A metaphorical variant. That's the whole notion of the creativity that is there in art. But it's also here what is being expressed as a way to be innovative in our thinking. But at the same time, how he's delivering the speech is also de-automatizing. It is establishing a foregrounding. The whole speech that Wallace is giving is basically the speech itself is foregrounded against the genre of commencement speeches, like we've just seen with Denzel Washington and Steve Jobs. It is going against, it is also contrary to what everyone expected from this postmodern writer, how he writes.
I know that this stuff probably doesn't sound fun and breezy or grandly inspirational the way a commencement speech is supposed to sound. What it is, as far as I can see, is the capital T truth with a whole lot of rhetorical niceties stripped away. You are, of course, free to think of it whatever you wish. But please don't just dismiss it as some finger-wagging Dr. Laura sermon. None of this stuff is really about morality or religion or dogma or big fancy questions of life after death. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about the real value of a real education, which has almost nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with simple awareness. Awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us all the time, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water. This is water. It is unimaginably hard to do this, to stay conscious and alive in the adult world day in and day out. Which means yet another grand cliche turns out to be true. Your education really is the job of a lifetime, and it commences now. I wish you way more than luck.
This is water. What is water? It's the automatic. It's so in front of us as the background that we don't even pay attention to it. We don't even hardly notice it anymore. And so what did David Foster Wallace do to get our attention? He created the anti-commencement speech. Contrary to the genre. He goes contrary to his own literary style. He's advocating a counter-reality. That's what the text is. The whole point of de-automatization. It is indeed one outstanding example of an extended metaphor. The whole speech itself is indeed a metaphor, a metaphorical variant from what one expects in this genre, which we've just been looking at in terms of Steve Jobs and Denzel Washington. The need to de-automatize, that is his theme, that is his hypothesis.
Let America be America again.
Let it be the dream it used to be. America. Never was America to me.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its dream.
Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed.
We are talking about a society in which there will be no roles other than those chosen or those earned.
Let it be the great, strong land of love.
Where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme. That any man be crushed by one above.
It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath.
We cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore.
But opportunity is real and life is free.
The question always is, what kind of a world do we want to be a part of?
Equality is in the air we breathe.
So I would like to say that we're one tonight. Let us be one in the future. Power to all of us.
There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Who said the free?
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best.
And we have some bad hombres here, and we're going to get them out. There should be a lot of systems beyond that.
This Freedom Restoration Act was signed into law last week.
You could see there was blood coming out of her eyes. Blood coming out of her
I don't know what I said. I'd like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you. Here's a brief summary of my executive orders. New vetting to keep terrorists out of the United States, a border wall, and a great rebuilding of the armed services of the United States.
For all the dreams we've dreamed and all the hopes we've held,
The millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream
that's almost dead
today.
We know the battle ahead will be long. But always remember that no matter what obstacles stand in our way, nothing can stand in the way of the power of millions of voices calling for change.
We are always going to fight for this country. We will not stand for this.
Yes, we can.
out of the wreck and ruin of our gangster death?
The rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies.
We the people must redeem.
If you dare to struggle, you dare to win. If you dare not to struggle, then goddamn it, you don't deserve to win.
And make
America
No, but there's hope for a better world.
again.
Why don't you live for me? Why don't you struggle for me? Why don't you die for me?
Remember, I played this in the first lecture. What's really fascinating about it is this isn't the whole poem by Langston Hughes. It's, in fact, just a part of the poem that he wrote, which is longer. I'm going to play in a moment. What has been done is to take out certain parts of that poem and overlay it with images, with voices that also add to the way in which one responds to what's being said. Let America be America again. Let it be. Repeating this, let it, at the same time as you overlay it, as I said, with Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream, the scenes of riots and demonstrations, Donald Trump, the blank screen. Notice that most of these are, if we go back and let, we've dreamed, we've held, our, we. When we look at them, the poem, the original poem, you'll notice that what's been taken out is mainly those which are the we, the first person plural. Before I continue to play it, I just want to highlight that what I have put in red is what was in the video. And what you see in black is what was originally there within the poem. Here the poem now will be read in its entirety.
Let America be America again, by Langston Hughes. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. America was never America to me. Let America be the dream the dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great, strong land of love where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by one above. It was never America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free, equality in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. Say, who are you that mumbles in the dark? And who are you that draws your veil across the stars? I am the poor, white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. I am the young man full of strength and hope, tangled in that ancient endless chain of profit, power, gain, of grab the land, of grab the gold, of grab the ways of satisfying need, of work the men, of take the pay, way of owning everything for one's own greed. I am the farmer, bondsman to the soil. I am the worker, sold to the machine. I am the Negro, servant to you all. I am the people, humble, hungry, mean, hungry yet today, despite the dream, beaten yet today. Oh, pioneers, I am the man who never got ahead. I am the poorest worker bartered through the years yet. I am the one who dreamt our basic dream in the old world while still a serf of kings, who dreamt a dream so strong, so brave, so true, that even yet its mighty daring sings in every brick and stone, in every furrow turn that's made America the land it has become. Oh, I am the man who sailed those early seas in search of what I meant to be my home. For I am the one who left dark Ireland's shore, and Poland's plain, and England's grassy lay, and torn from black Africa's strand to build a homeland of the free. The free? Who said the free? Not me. Surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shot down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay, for all the dreams we've dreamed and all the songs we've sung and all the hopes we've held and all the flags we've hung, the millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream that's almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has yet been and yet must be the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain from those who live like leeches on people's lives. We must take back our land again. America, oh yes, I say it plain. America was never America to me. And yet I swear this oath. America will be, out of the rake and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft, of stealth and lies, we, the people, must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain. All the stretch of these great green states, and make America again.
So what do you think? You notice that a lot of what's been taken out is the first person reference, which to me comes across very, very powerfully as then the statement of one's own personal feeling. I felt it much as a personal statement in terms of the poem itself, rather than sort of by taking out all the first person and leaving only the we, it lost that personal feeling. It became just sort of taking out the words that would perhaps create the strongest impression. It's the difference between putting the wording together as a poem as opposed to taking out certain of the words to put it into the context of a completely different medium with a completely, I won't say a different message, but I do feel the power of that message is here brought out in the language itself rather than through the pictures, the medium that is being expressed there. I see it as a very personal experience in the poem. I don't get that sense of that personal experience in the video. Two different ways of taking and producing a different response.
We're going to take a look at
what I'm going to do now is I'm going to conclude with this speech that was given by Churchill. We shall fight them on the beaches. A really inspirational speech.
I believe we are to meet regularly.
Once a week, I'm afraid. How are you for Mondays?
I shall endeavor to be available on Mondays.
4 o'clock?
I nap at 4.
Is that permissible?
No, but necessary. I work late.
And perhaps lunchtime.
Lunch? Mondays? Your Majesty.
Prime Minister.
You've wanted this your entire adult life.
No, since the nursery. What do the public want me?
It's your own party to whom you'll have to prove yourself.
I'm getting the job only because the ship is sinking. It's not a gift, it's revenge.
Let them see your true qualities, your courage.
My poor judgment.
Your lack of vanity.
Yeah, my iron will.
Your sense of humour.
Ho, ho, ho.
Now go.
Go?
Be
what?
yourself.
There's nothing heroic in going down fighting if it can be avoided. Nothing even remotely patriotic in death or glory if the odds are firmly on the former. Nothing inglorious in trying to shorten a war that we are clearly losing.
Losing? Europe is still...
Europe is lost. And before our forces are wiped out completely, now is the time to negotiate in order to obtain the best conditions possible. Hitler will not insist on outrageous terms. He will know his own weaknesses. He will be reasonable.
When will the lesson be learned? When will the lesson be learned? How many more dictators must be wooed, appeased, good God, given him mixed privileges, before we learn? You cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth!
We must now select my successor, and it's only one man the opposition will accept.
He stands for one thing, and one thing only, himself.
Why have I been forced to send for Churchill? His record is a catastrophe.
Let them see your true qualities, your lack of vanity.
Yeah, my iron will.
Your sense of humour.
Ho, ho, ho. Your Majesty.
It is my duty to invite you to take up the position of Prime Minister of this United Kingdom.
I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister.
The Germans have encircled 60 British and French divisions. We are looking at a collapse of Western Europe within the next few days.
How long have they got if we don't rescue them?
Maybe 2 days. We would need a miracle to get our men out.
You have the full weight of the world on your shoulders.
We're facing certain defeat on land, the annihilation of our army, and imminent invasion. We must negotiate peace talks.
When will the lesson be learned? You cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth!
Nonsense. The only slippery slope.
Would you stop interrupting me while I am interrupting you? We have before us many, many long months of struggle and suffering. Even though many old and famous states have fallen into the grip of the Nazi rule, we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender! For without victory, there can be no survival.
All right, now, this speech, one arguably can say, changed history. It's this "we shall fight them on the beaches" speech that was given by Churchill. Now you have some feel for the background, the historical background to what's taking place. But notice what do you see in this speech? What comes through? To defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, to outlive the menace of tyranny. Repeating things in threes. Notice the kinds of things that occur at the beginning of each of these clauses. That is what we're going to try to do. That is the resolve of His Majesty's government. That is the will of Parliament. This, again, it's these repeating things in threes. As we go through this, we also have the repetition. In this one part, which I've put in the box, you'll notice the we. How many times is we repeated? And the verb, flag or fail, fight, 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 defend, fight, 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 never surrender. That repetition, those repeating things in threes, even in pairs, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. This patterning, a very clear patterning, is what gives this speech its power. It's what got across a message that, as we've just said, and in which we can see, changed history. He mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. Language can motivate. Language can inspire. Language can change people's minds. Language can change history. This is the power of language. What is behind that power of language? Today we've looked at various examples of commencement speeches. We've looked at poetry, how poetry can move and cause us to respond again in a very to what we see in terms of, in some cases, the injustice, cause a response. And here, looking at language as it's used to motivate people, to mobilize the English language to go into battle. So, just a reminder, your term paper, and if you do have questions about what it is that you would like to be doing, you don't have to get my permission, but if you do have something in mind and you're wondering whether it's a good idea or not, feel free to contact me by email, and happy to discuss with you. And please remember also your last and final continuous participation task. Identify the linguistic features of motivation speeches. Having looked at what we looked at today, that should be very easy to do. All right, so I hope you have a very nice holiday in the week to come, and I hope that you're able to get some work done on your term paper, which will be due on the 23rd. So thank you for your attention today, and see you in 2 weeks' time. Okay, have a good holiday.